Hello, I'm John Gatto, and I travel by the name John Taylor Gatto. I was a New York City public school teacher for 30 years, and I resigned from school teaching on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal in 1991. And since that time, I've traveled 1.5 million miles in all 50 states and 8 foreign countries, trying to arrest the career of the institution of government schooling. One of the really useful pieces of research that I've engaged in for the past 11 or 12 years is studying the 18 or 20 elite private boarding schools that set the tone for approximately 300 such schools and produce a substantial chunk of our national leadership. I don't think there are many people aware of the fact that in the 2000 presidential election, that 4 of the 6 finalists for the presidency went to one or another of these schools. George Bush went to Andover. John McCain went to Episcopal High. Steve Forbes went to Brooke. And Al Gore, I think Gore went to St. Andrews, but if you let me look at my note, St. Albans in Washington, D.C. These schools only graduate about 1,000 kids a year. This is a nation of 300 million, and yet 4 of the 6 finalists for the presidency attended schools that only graduate 1,000 a year. So I thought there might be some real utility in finding out what these schools teach as opposed to what public schools teach. And that job proved to be much easier than I thought. So I'd like to share with you the 14 principles that I discovered that are universal among these schools. Even though each is quite a different animal than the next, they all concentrate on these 14 themes. The first of these themes is that no kid should graduate without a theory of human nature. What makes people tick? What buttons do you press to get the results from your fellow man and woman that you want? And where does the fund of lore come from? Not from psychology, not even in a small way. The fund of lore about human nature comes from history, philosophy, theology, that's a curse word, isn't it, in public schooling, literature, and law. These 5 mighty agencies of human history and the human mind have a wealth of information about what human beings are like now, have been like, and probably always will be like. And every kid is expected to have a degree of expertise drawn from these sources. I guess I should say these databases. The second requirement of these schools is that every graduate have a strong experience with the active literacies. Now, we're all familiar with literacy as some exercise in reading, but the active literacies are writing and public speaking. No matter how well developed your mind becomes on strong texts, it's useless to convince anyone else of your point of view unless you can write well and you can speak well. I think we've come to this juncture in history believing that that's some God-given gift that only a few people have. I can guarantee you as a school teacher for 30 years that both of those skills are extremely easy to teach. To teach public speaking, you simply have to offer regular opportunities to speak before a group of strangers. That could be a group as small as 1, 2, or 3, or it could be an auditorium full of strangers. But the fact that they're not people that you feel comfortable with, I think, is essential. To write well, it requires nothing more than that you write constantly and regularly, every day, preferably. The improvement will occur quite naturally. At that point, you might be able to profitably use some expert intervention, but in the process of reaching competency, intervention is the worst possible thing, simply the practice of doing it. So now we have a theory of human nature and skill in the active literacies. Number 3, among the curriculum themes that unite these elite private boarding schools, is insight into the major institutional forms, like our courts or our corporations or our military, including details of the ideas which drive them. I'll only give you one sample of this so that you can see how seriously government schools fall short of the mark in offering insight into these institutions. We have all heard endlessly in schools of separation of powers, that the governance of the United States is divided into at least 3 compartments. 1, an executive compartment, 1, a legislative compartment, that further divided into 2 compartments of its own, and finally a judicial department. Now, a little bit of reflection should show you what the purpose of that is. Not that we all live in harmony and agree in times of trouble with what to say and do, but exactly the opposite of that. That the only possible way to arrive at an approximation of truth is through argument. The more skillful the argument on all sides, the better for the ultimate resultant of truth. So that people who appear before you in the media and say, in this time of trouble, dissent is not wanted, are truly un-American, because this country was the world's first laboratory of dissent on the part of everybody. That's really what the American dream is largely composed of. The ability to speak your mind in a public forum. So that kind of understanding, which is kept under close wraps in public schooling, is examined minutely in these elite private boarding schools. There are many, many other working engines of our institutions that we're not allowed to understand. I might contradict myself and give you one more. The military, which is quite an expensive institution to maintain, even in times of peace, is always constituted at the fraction of 1 to 1.5% of the entire adult male population. Never heard that before? That was a rule or a principle worked out in Prussian Germany several hundred years ago. Now, your homework is to find out why that fraction, but I'll give you a clue. The prison population of the United States is very close to the military population in the United States, and that fraction, too, was worked out in Prussian Germany about 200 years ago. So you should expect the teachers that impact on your kids to be aware of these things and hundreds more like them, and to make that the meat of their contact with kids. And if you're homeschooling, do your homework. And that's not meant to be sarcastic. You'll grow each time you add one of these concepts to your own mental base. The fourth thing that private schools do, or elite private boarding schools do, that public schools hardly touch, are the repeated exercises in the forms of good manners and politeness, based on the utter truth that politeness and civility is the foundation of all future relationships, all future alliances, access to places that you might want to go there. Now, don't tell me, well, that's just common sense, because any public school I've ever been in, and I've been in hundreds, is a laboratory of rudeness, cruelty, sloppiness, coarseness. The fifth thing that private boarding schools emphasize is independent work. Think again about the possible reasons for that. In public schools as we know them, the teacher is charged with about 80 to 90% of filling the time available, one way or another, and all the choices of the teachers. But in independent private boarding education, that ratio ideally is reversed. It probably never is completely reversed, but the weighting is shockingly different. The kids do most of the work. They're expected to do most of the work. They're expected to be resourceful enough to use the work of other kids also, not in public school. The sixth principle is that energetic physical sports aren't a luxury or a way to blow off steam, but they're absolutely the only way to confer grace on the human presence, and that grace translates into power, into money later on. I was talking to David yesterday about the perception of George Washington as a very average mind among his own contemporaries, but nobody said that his physical presence was average. Washington, in his diaries, tells us that the two most important things that made him George Washington were deliberately selected. One was horseback riding, and the other was ballroom dancing, because it conferred a commanding physical presence on the person who could do those things well. Also, sports teach you practice in handling pain, in dealing with emergencies which occur regularly in sports. The seventh curricular theme in elite private boarding schools is a complete theory of access to any workplace or any person. You'd do better off than reading a civics textbook to set a kid the challenge of getting a private meeting with the mayor of Los Angeles and let him work for a year on constructing an access to the mayor. Does that sound fanciful to you? My kids from a very ordinary New York public school got access not only to New York City's mayor, but to New York State's governor and CEOs beyond count. You can do that too. Teach your kid how to access places and people that he or she wants or needs. Number 8 is responsibility as an utterly essential part of the curriculum. Now, yes, that includes things like washing dishes, but in elite private boarding schools, you ask a kid to care for a horse, to take some important community service, to go for leadership in clubs, much easier to get than you think, because if the club is actually doing anything, it's a lot of hard work to be the leader, and very few people want that. Always to grab for responsibility when it's offered, and always to deliver more than is asked for. Number 9, and this is a long-range, comprehensive thing that needs to be checked regularly, but you don't ever quite get there. It's arrival at a personal code of standards. Those are standards in production, standards in behavior, and standards in morality. Number 10 is a familiarity with the master creations in music, in painting, in dance, in sculpture, in design, in architecture, in literature, in drama. To be at ease with the arts, because apart from religion, the arts are the only way to transcend the animal materiality of our lives, to get in touch with a bigger you. Number 11 is the power of accurate observation and recording. I'll only give you one example of how you think this way, and if you push yourself, you will be able to supply many more. Power of accurate observation and recording. It used to be an axiom among the British upper classes that if you could not draw what you saw with your eye, then you in fact were not seeing what was there. So drawing wasn't a way to kill time, but a way to sharpen the perception. Charles Darwin, not my favorite human being, but nevertheless a major name in intellectual history over the past 150 years. If Charles Darwin had not been able to skillfully draw, then no one would have attended to his well-articulated theory of the evolution of the favored races. Look at the title of the book. It's usually left out, that part. But don't let me editorialize here. Modern science, in some very great regard, has only been possible through graphic representations, drawing and photography. Number 12 is the ability to deal with challenges of all sorts. Now this one's my favorite, because one person's challenge is another person's ho-hum. To know what will challenge your son or your daughter, you have to know your son or daughter very, very well. If you have a kid who's painfully shy, obviously public presentations are the challenge that the kid needs as a corrective to rather than live the rest of their lives. If your child is a coward, that's a harsh word but many people are natural cards. Maybe all of us are natural cards until we come to see that physical challenges really aren't so bad. And if they hurt, they don't hurt that much. Teach your kid, if he gets knocked down, always to stand back up. If he gets knocked down again, to stand back up again. That would be a challenge. But challenges are different for different people there. If you're used to eating garbage food at the fast food outlets, I guess it will be a challenge to train your palate to discriminate fresh food and excellence in preparation from a Big Mac. I guess I only picked that one because my wife is a superb cook, and she graduated from the Culinary Institute in Hyde Park. See, Janet, I told you I wouldn't forget you. Number 13, we're coming to the end of this curricular list, is a habit of caution in reasoning to conclusions. Should Iraq be invaded by the most technologically sophisticated military in the history of the planet, and should hundreds of billions of dollars be allotted to that purpose? Well, maybe it should and maybe it shouldn't. But listening to a few government propaganda hours about the similarities between the leader of Iraq and Adolf Hitler is not the way to come to the conclusion, even though it's the way that 80 or 90% of us do. And finally is the constant development and testing of judgment. You make judgments, you discriminate value, and then you follow up. You keep an eye on your predictions to see how far skewed from what actually occurs or how consistent with what transpires things are. Now, this might not be the totality of a great curriculum, but let me tell you from where I sit there, this is well worth considering long and hard as a diet for your own school practice.